Thank you to Olia and to Jessica. Thank you very much. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is a little bit askew from the kinds of presentations you've been having. Most of the talks I've been to have either focused on the esoteric influences on a philosophical thinker or a philosophical reading of an esoteric thinker. I'm not going to do that at all. What this is an unlikely form of serious play. I'm going to be focusing on a US military occult industrial research complex. The reading of it is according to History and Philosophy of Science. But last night, in a stroke of inspiration, I totally rewrote the conclusion. So it's less about philosophy of science and about some other things I hope you'll find relevant or maybe not. I can't promise to have all the philosophical sophistication today with this topic, but I hope at least to keep you all entertained. And I know that I tend to speak too quickly when I get excited, so I have a lot on the PowerPoint so that you can follow along as I go. Okay, let me start the timer. Okay. Through a Dark Prism, US military occult research and the cultural history of rationality. Slide. How does it? No? Okay, maybe with that. Okay. In 2021, something called the Gateway Experience went viral on social media. At the center of the viral sensation was a curious Cold War artifact, a declassified US Army document from 1983 titled Analysis and Assessment of Gateway Process. First released in 2003 with one page conspicuously missing, it had languished in online conspiracy forums for years until the missing page was quietly declassified 2 decades after the original document was declassified. What was this Gateway Experience? The text described the Gateway Experience as follows. The Gateway Experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres, so as alter consciousness, moving it outside the physical sphere, so as ultimately to escape even the restrictions of time and space. What, you might ask, so if that's the Gateway Experience, what did the missing page contain? This was the missing page. It begins mid-sentence. Absolute, as it probably originally meant to be, is the model around which the evolution of time-space revolves to ultimately attain a reflection of and union with him, capitalized. Whether it's the stylized labyrinth once popular in the Hellenic world, the spiralized version of the Hebrew tree of life, or its Hindu counterpart, or the Chinese spiral through the fourfold powers, the ultimate meaning is the same. Mystics the world over, it seems, have perceived the universal hologram in the same spiral form. So let's pause here for a second. This is not a yoga pamphlet or a New Age recruiting document. This is a US Army intelligence text. The Gateway Experience, in other words, wasn't just a covert surveillance tool, it was a spiritual ascent protocol, a militarized pathway to union with God. The further oddity, even for those already aware of the Stargate project and US research on remote viewing, is that the group behind the Gateway Experience explicitly adopted artifacts and rituals from the occult milieu of the period, including magical wands. I'll focus on this a little bit later in the talk. So our first question is, what is this doing in the archive of a putatively secular Cold War agency? This talk explores that question through the lens of the Gateway process and the broader occult military complex surrounding it. My goal is not to uncover whether these techniques work, but rather to treat this material as a strange but telling episode in the cultural history of reason. Drawing on methods in the history and philosophy of science, I able to destabilize received narratives, ones that dismiss magical practices as irrational holdovers or exotic alternatives to reason. What this archive reveals is that the categories of rationality and belief were themselves partially the product of the Cold War, produced, regulated, and weaponized in specific historical conditions. And sometimes, under enough pressure, even the guardians of reason have reached for a wand. That's what I'm going to show. By way of background, I've been sort of working around this triad for a little bit and looking at how they were historically constituted. In other words, I'm not essentializing the difference between religion and science or religion and magic / superstition, but tracing the way that different actors position things in relation to these three master categories. I've done a couple books on this, one starting out from religion first, focused on Japan, one focused on the notion of superstition or magic, focused on Europe. There's a third that I'm working on that has to do with science, returning again. That one is also back to Japan, and I'll end this talk with a gesture to that. But what I'm doing here more organically emerges as a work in progress related to something that came up in my Myth of Disenchantment book, which is the notion that the paranormal is normal, which is something that the survey data, there's a lot of metrics for this, and survey data is pretty weak, but let's just go with it for the moment. The survey data suggests, for instance, that 73% of Americans have at least one paranormal belief. This is the Baylor survey, or the Gallup survey of 2005. And we have similar paranormal belief. The category paranormal is in the survey, not me. I'm not trying to impose this. In Great Britain, where belief in God is quite at a different interval. And indeed, looking at the limited sociological data from other parts of Western Europe suggests that a lot of people believe in things like haunted houses, astrology, extraterrestrials, necromancy, witches, and psychical powers. So part of the argument of my Myth of Disenchantment book, I discussed this material just briefly in a chapter, is to disaggregate disenchantment and secularization. Indeed, I want to show how, as certain kinds of religious and scientific authorities lose their hold in particular cultures, we actually have belief fragmentation. What this means is that the same people don't hold the same paranormal beliefs. For instance, an evangelical Christian who believes in the reality of demonic possession in a particular moment often dismisses people who believe in extraterrestrials, saying those extraterrestrials are really demons. Similarly, a psychical researcher intensely engaged in belief in the power of psychic powers may dismiss the existence of demons as merely epiphenomena or definitely outside the world, as a kind of spirit perhaps, or maybe even not even as spiritual entities, but as products of the mind. So all this is to say, it's precisely the belief fragmentation that leads toward certain kinds of rejected knowledge in one way or another, or cross-contaminations of rejected knowledge. So anyway, I'll explore that in some detail. But I wanted in this, the material I'm going to present you today is very much in rough form. It's a back-burnered monograph where I'm playing with some things in our contemporary moment. Anyway, I'll explain that a little bit more later. So with the notion that this is a work in progress, let me continue and give you a little snippet of the cultural history of rationality. So I begin first with a quote from Wittgenstein. What men consider reasonable or unreasonable alters. At certain periods, men find reasonable what at other periods they found unreasonable, and vice versa. Again, the gendered language is in Wittgenstein. I have some folks that I'm arguing with, and the first and central figure whom I want to polemically oppose is Charles Taylor. There may be Charles Taylor's fans in the audience. My condolences. I don't mean it to be that harsh, but Charles Taylor has famously said several things in the secular age, like, let me start with the enchanted world, the world of spirits, demons, moral forces, which our predecessors acknowledged. The process of the disenchantment is the disappearance of this world. We moderns are not deterred by older taboos or supposedly sacred orderings, so we can rationalize the world, expel the mystery from it. He goes on to say, both science and virtue require that we disenchant the world that we make the rigorous distinction between mind and body, note this, and we have set up a firm boundary, the one, as we have seen, which defines what he calls the buffered self. And finally, the buffered self is the agent who no longer fears demons, spirits, or magical forces. I'm going to show how this is wrong. Okay. There are other trends that I want to undercut here. This is a little bit of an old cliche, and it is about the irrationality of magic. Here is Valerie Flint. It's otherwise an interesting and good book, and I don't mean to knock her work at all, but she does say, magic and science are, of course, very old enemies, and it will always be the aim of science, in the sense in which we generally understand the term, to eliminate the irrationality and the mysteries of magic. Is that true? Let's think about this. What are we talking about when we're talking about rationality here? So the first point we might observe is that many European languages contain two terms, reason and rationality. Usually the second is later. So Vernunft versus Rationalität in German, or raison et rationalité in French. Part of the problem is that these terms are frequently conflated, and there's inconsistent usages of either. So I'll focus on rationality and reason a little bit interchangeably, and we can worry about whether we should be making more analytical distinctions between them in the talk. But let me tell you also, let me begin, as all good myth makers do, with a myth of origins. Let us begin with a myth, a particular kind of myth, a myth about the end of myth. And I'm sure it's one you've heard it before. Philosophy and philosophers love to tell it. It is the story of of philosophy's own genesis, dressed in the robes of historical inevitability. The tale goes like this. At some decisive moment in ancient Greece, myth gave way to reason. The enchanted world of gods and ritual, of Homeric song and cultic rhythm, was ruptured by a sudden miracle. Logos emerged. Rationality itself was born, and philosophy, the story is told, stepped onto the stage of history. Depending on versions of this story, the heroes of the transformation vary. For some, its protagonist is Thales, Anaximander, Heraclitus, or pre-Socratics in general. Or the pivot is placed later with Plato's critique of poetry and his elevation of argumentation over the seductive powers of mimesis. Either way, the structure of the story holds a clean break, a civilizational leap, a dawn. But I want to suggest something far more disruptive. This story is itself mythic, and it didn't happen, at least not like that. Or more precisely, it was not experienced or conceptualized by that way by those who lived through it. And the idea that there was a rupture between mythos and the logos in the period is a retrospective construction, a modern fable about the origins of rationality. The phrase, for instance, vom mythos zum logos, from myth to reason, was itself coined and canonized by Wilhelm Nestler quite late in his 1940 study of early Greek thought. Nestler's project was to trace the emergence of rational explanation from the symbolic and religious frameworks he identified in archaic Greece, but what he provided was less a reconstruction than a teleological myth, a narrative of progress and continuity disguised as a rupture. This is a broader myth whose origins I interrogate at length in the myth of disenchantment. I don't need to probably rehearse for this audience the many reasons it fails to hold up. Any good classicist knows that early Greek philosophy was not some break from a pre-philosophical past. While logos did gain increasing privileged status in certain social local circles, it did so without an antithetical relationship to mythos. Philosophers were less demythologizers than interpreters of mythos. Even Plato, so often evoked as the logos to Homer's mythos, the mythic persisted in subterranean forms. In the myth of the cave, the chariot, the soul's celestial circuit. And this story also tends to cut off everything that happens after Aristotle and to bracket out the whole Neoplatonic history of philosophy, which was so determinate, and we've been talking about this together for quite so. We know that this bifurcation is artificial, but it's part of the way that philosophy has retroactively constructed its origins to admit both late antiquity and most of medieval thought. And we've seen that in the presentations that y'all have given, which have also evacuated that middle, and evacuated generally, but not completely. And I'm not banging you for this. This is just that, you know, we all have different specialties, but it also ignoring the role of Islam and Islamicate world in the formation of that very historical trajectory. There have been exceptions. I'm not saying none, but anyway. But philosophy in this contemporary telling is taken to be reason's true custodian. More than that, its birthplace, its temple. One might even say its tribunal. Reason will eventually be cast as a purified form of thought, disembedded, disenchanted, distinct from myth, emotion, revelation, and imagination. This is a reified conception of reason, abstract, autonomous, sovereign, that becomes both the destiny and the credential of philosophy itself. Recast, philosophy defines itself by what is not, and what it is not myth, it is not ritual, it is not madness, it is not the body. And in so doing, it installs a particular image of reason as both origin and trajectory, and seemingly renders everything else irrational by default. But this version of reason is itself not eternal. It has a particular history I'm going to unveil. Reason has a history both in terms of what seemed reasonable and in the very meaning of reason itself. And rather than pretend it didn't have a history, I want to offer a few fragments of that history, just enough to trouble the idea that reason has ever had a stable or universal meaning, even within the philosophical canon itself. So, yeah, okay. And I can note also, philosophy is long also contained within itself an anti-philosophy. There's a notion of enshrining Socrates as the leading figure of philosophy, whose main arguments were mostly against other figures, is a wonderful irony. So anyway, I'll return to this later. Okay. So let's start with our first snapshot, a very familiar figure, often equally mythologized, René Descartes. In his Discours de la méthode pour bien conduire sa raison, discourse on the method for well conducting, carrying out reason, he says, for whereas reason is a universal instrument that can be used in all kinds of situations, it is for all practical purposes impossible for a machine. So why is Descartes saying this? So the figure of the automata is quite frequent in Descartes' thought. He actually was argued that the distinctive nature of the rational soul, which he saw as universal in humans, was not available to animals or automata, and he equated the two. It's kind of screwed up. They say the rumor was that he like dissected pigs looking for the part of the brain, and that he carried in his contemporaries described him carrying a clockwork woman around with him when he traveled, and that it was considered creepy, if I can cuss, creepy as fuck. But what actually this shows is that Descartes, he's not the dualist that most people have attributed to him, but he articulated a notion of reason that was the opposite of mechanical reason. And indeed, his reason was independent of the senses. This is where the empiricist, rationalist split later projected on him is somewhat fair, but this was a reason that he thought led to God. And significantly, this contributed to his bifurcation of cause and reason. Now, preceding figures already in medieval Christian environment had begun that bifurcation. So he's continuing the work of the scholastics here, not refuting them. But we'll note that in Aristotle, those are not separate phenomena. Reasons and causes are not distinct. And Leibniz, I cut a slide on Leibniz, where we're trying to resuture them together with principle of sufficient reason, etc. Okay, that's our first snapshot. Anti-mechanical. Oh, and that's from his Le Monde, his book on where he tries to do a human anatomy and produce a map of the cosmos. All the fun stuff in Descartes is the stuff people don't read, sadly. Okay. So Kant, another famous figure, equally influential and important. So if Descartes defined reason by its independence from the body and irreducibility to mechanism, Immanuel Kant gave it a moral upgrade. For Kant, reason isn't just what allows us to think, it is what makes us free. I'm simplifying a lot, but in his moral philosophy, and especially in his Grundlage zur Metaphysik der Sitten, groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, he casts reason as an inner legislator, the faculty that gives itself laws. A rational being in this view is not so much capable of calculation or deduction, but crucially autonomy, self-rule, self-binding, self-constraint. To act rationally, and I'm not saying anything new, is to act according to principles you could will as universal laws. As he puts it, autonomy is thus the ground of the dignity of the human and of every rational nature. Of course, he explored reason and his limits, but in doing this, Kant doubles down on an aspect of Descartes' legacy. He makes reason the great divider again, this time not just between humans and machines, but between those capable of moral law and those excluded from it. Reason becomes a threshold of ethical personhood, and it's impossible to read this without reading Kant's Anthropology, where you see that there's a kind of racial agenda. I mean, I don't want to oversay, okay, yes, Kant was a racist. That doesn't mean all of what he's saying is wrong, but you can see that this notion of autonomy has built into it a kind of hierarchy of personhood, built into his formulation of reason, okay, and in a kind of beginnings of an epistemic hierarchy. I'll now shift, skipping a bunch of time, to another figure. Fast forward to 1863. No, sorry, 1836. John Stuart Mill publishes his essay on the definition of political economy, and with it, we begin to see the consolidation of a new figure, the rational economic actor. Mill himself doesn't fully articulate the figure who will be called Homo economicus, but he lays the foundations for this figure. Political economy, he argues, is the science of behavior governed by the desire for wealth and the aversion to labor. It abstracts away everything else: love, honor, envy, solidarity, not to deny their existence, but to bracket them for the sake of clarity. We start to have the introduction of a notion of rationality or reason here in a descriptive sense rather than a normative or prescriptive sense. That's the move, and rationality here becomes a kind of methodological minimalism. Mill's economic man doesn't emerge fully from his pen, but it's in his students and successors in the next generation that will sharpen the figure into something far more rigid and doctrinal, where it won't be just an artificial posit or model, but a description of what is supposed to be human nature. By the end of the 19th century, the figure is fully articulated here. Homo economicus, and they literally use that expression, a figure that behaves in the following way. Homo economicus seeks to maximize utility, whatever that means. Behavior is ends means rational. This is central to the figure. And independence, preferences and judgments are unaffected by others. It's an individualistic figure. And indeed, central to the formation of economics as a modern discipline will be the bracketing out of preferences as an exogenous variables that are extrinsic to what's modeled in the economy. This is going to be actually one of the huge failings of capitalist economics, I will argue, but we'll go into this perhaps in the Q&A. Okay. I'm going to fast forward a little bit again. So fragment 4, cybernetics and Cold War rationality, or the rise of the machine mind. We see early anticipations of this in the work of Ada Lovelace, where often described as the first computer programmer, although we could debate, in her desire, her recognition fundamentally that computers, analytical engines, Babbage's analytical engine, could be used not just to reckon figures, but to model more complex things. And she imagined producing a calculus of the nervous system, which she was unable to live long enough to fulfill. This has its distant descendants in what will become, under the influence of folks like Norbert Wiener, a kind of cybernetics, which will then focus on the machine as the model of the mind, feedback and control systems as the central metaphor of human thinking processes. I got off script. By mid-20th century, something else strange had happened to reason. What had once been the hallmark of the human soul, the moral lawgiver or the autonomous chooser, was now modeled on something no longer human, entirely, we could argue, other, namely the machine. This was the era of what we could call Cold War rationality. Cybernetics, systems theory, early computer science, and military strategy converged to produce a new image of the mind, and with it a new image of reason. The model was no longer the philosopher king or the self-legislating agent or the rational soul. It was the information processor. A few key features define this shift. Essentially, the machine is the model, cognition reimagined as signal processing, feedback loops, and formal computation. Thoughts became idealized as circuitry. Then, drawing from economics, rational choice theory emerges as the dominant framework in the social sciences, depicting individuals as strategic actors, maximizing expected outcomes in well-defined environments. The richness of human motivations was collapsed into preference ranking and payoff matrices. We see game theory as the main essential way to model this, especially the zero-sum variety, offering a language for strategy that was abstract, adversarial, and detached. Human society fit the capitalist model of individual against individual, right? Locked in strategic conflict, calculating risks and payoffs without empathy or ethics. Second, reasoning itself becomes probabilistic. This is the Bayesian modeling of reasoning, which, anyway, Bayesianing reframes rationality not as deductive certainty, but as continually updating of beliefs based on available data, a logic of inference under probabilistic terms, more suited perhaps to machines than moral deliberators. I don't mean to completely bash Bayesianism, but it has problems. And rationality is increasingly decontextualized and rendered algorithmic. Rationality is universal and it is not particular. And yet, paradoxically, in the same period that the cybernetic model is articulated, the rationality is embedding itself again and again covertly in different kinds of implicit hierarchies and epistemic others. So the 1950s, for instance, is a key moment where we have gendered and racialized hierarchies of reasonable and unreasonable folks. Anyway, okay. This model is a crap model, and we've often inherited it in the social sciences, not in esoteric studies particularly, thankfully, but in many other fields of the academy, many of my colleagues. There's pushback and pushback in the period, but I wanted to address, I'm going to give a specific example of pushback, but I want to problematize a simple pushback because, yeah. Right. Yeah, well, I slipped some stuff, but that's okay. I'll just show just one example of pushback. A pushback that goes so far, it actually loops back from anti-racism into racial supremacy discourse. I'm speaking about Nihonjinron, a genre of thought centered on the uniqueness of the Japanese people. We see it emerging distantly in the 19th century, but it took firm roots in the 20th century, first in the 1930s as part of a rising tide of nationalism, and then doubled down in the period of cybernetic rationality in particular. We have key figures in the 70s and 80s. And here's one example, a key figure, Tsunoda Tadanobu, who in works such as Nihonjin no, which is the Japanese mind, this is a depiction, you can see the Japanese mind as a dude, and he's got a lot of things on his brain. What Tsunoda was arguing was that Japanese brain functions differently than the Western one. According to this line of thought, the Japanese process sound, emotions, and language in neurologically distinct ways, granting them privileged access to, quote, non-logical or, quote, non-rational modes of understanding unavailable to Westerners. Logical reasoning in the Western sense is downplayed or reframed as alien, and individualist conceptions give way to what was described as, quote unquote, groupism, a collective intuitive sensibility cast as both culturally superior and neurologically hardwired. In the first case, this makes sense as a response to the narrowness of Cold War rationality. Cold War rationality had been too individualistic, and so this is a corrective to that. Cold War rationality had hierarchies built into it about what counted as rational. But we can see how flipping too far the other direction leads toward something that's not an accurate description of Japanese thought, and something that very easily leads into the cultural nationalisms and in the 30s version of this, which anyway, it's connected to the right wing and particular movements of cultural nationalist defenses of Japanese imperialism in Japan. So this is a certain kind of paradox or trouble. Okay, before we go forward, I want to pause and tarry with this at this end of the section of the terrain. I'll make a few observations about a dominant view of rationality, one that still underwrites much of the discourse in the humans and social sciences. I'll set aside for now more recent developments in cognitive science, which I think are actually kind of cooler, but they'll haunt the edges of what follows. Okay, let's start with a basic slippage. The terms reason and rationality are often used interchangeably. That's common, but it's not always problematic. But beneath that usage lies a deeper bifurcation between two conceptions, one normative and one descriptive. Rationality is often conflated with reasoning itself and idealized models. rational choice theory are mistaken for accurate descriptions of how people actually think. There's a fundamental break here between a kind of normative descriptive project in philosophical context and a descriptive model of human thinking. Second, the isolated individual is reasoner. You could blame Descartes for this a little if you like to beat him up. I sometimes do. But from both normative and descriptive accounts, typically assume that reasoning happens within a solitary mind, detached from social, cultural, or relational contexts. We see this in game theory, but we see this in the solipsism of a post-Cartesian philosophy, especially the post-Cartesian philosophy that ignores his later project, that just treats the skepticism of the first meditation as the determinate view. This is the homunculi view of us doing philosophy as though we're isolated dudes looking out from a brain, okay? This leads to disembodied cognition and notions of belief. Reason is treated as computational, abstract, separate from practice and creedal states, modeled on Bayesian information from inference and information processing, rather than embodied emotional, cultural, or environmentally situated cognition. Okay. So if that's what I've been telling you about reason, that's the first half of the talk. The second half of the talk will tell you a little bit more about the military-industrial complex, and I'll put those two together at the end. In June 1983, U.S. Army Commander Wayne M. McDonnell was sent on a very unusual assignment. His task was to evaluate something called the Monroe Institute, depicted here, a private organization tucked away in the town of Faber, deep in the pastoral calm of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. But this was no ordinary wellness retreat. The Monroe Institute was known for its so-called mind-expanding protocols, particularly a technique called hemisync, short for hemispheric synchronization. The idea was simple, but the claim extraordinary. By using binaural beats, you could align the brain's hemisphere, alter consciousness, access deeper cognitive states, and actually transform both the individual and the world. McDonnell was not a civilian curiosity seeker. As I've noted, he was a military intelligence officer, and his mission was to figure out whether any of this had any operational value. Ultimately, he'd author the Gateway Memo, but the beginning of the military's interest in the Monroe Institute was actually 5 years earlier, with another document that we'll return to, the 1978 text, Gondola Wish, which was set out by members of Military Intelligence Association to evaluate anomalous cognition and potential sources of investigation for basically psychic spying. They listed the Monroe Institute as one of their initial places that CIA agents could be trained, and they sent the first two initial operatives there in 1978, but then there were questions about slippage of information, and the project was delayed before it was evaluated. Our Commander McDonnell was returning to a terrain to evaluate its value. So where did this whole idea, though, of military psychical research come from? Oh, wait, yeah, there's some more quotes I have from the. So this is what the document says in the Gondola Wish Assessment Report. I should have just read it. March 1978, the name Robert Monroe surfaced during a review of an open source document concerning Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a psychiatrist highly respected within the medical community for her work on terminally ill patients. The document stated that she had undergone a training program in out-of-body experiences conducted by one Robert Monroe and succeeded in mastering his techniques without difficulty. Monroe, after being contacted and vetted, agreed to train 3 military intelligence personnel in out-of-body experiences at his laboratory during October and November of 1978 for a fee of $2,000. This information was not to be shared with the press, other government agencies, or anyone else. That's what the now declassified document says. So anyway, that's where we start. But how do we get there? Okay, so one could argue that military psychic research, or at least military occult research, is quite old. For instance, already in the Napoleonic Wars, and there are some questions about whether about the vetting of this, but basically Napoleon's Central Intelligence Officer, at the very least, and probably not Napoleon himself, consulted with a famous cartomancer, Marie-Anne Lenormand. And she, there's a deck, there's a kind of card deck that you might get in France that she is attributed and sold in her name. She was a cartomancer, a tarot card reader, The interesting thing about Napoleon's spy chief is that it's a little unclear whether he's consulting her for her tarot to inform his future decision-making, or whether it's her skill as a gossip, because she was reading the fortune cards of a bunch of high-profile figures within the Napoleonic establishment. But it was part of Napoleon's fear of internal subversion. So he's using her to spy on his own French citizens, or at least his spy chief is doing so. But we finally have psychical research coming into the frame already with the First World War, at least that we know about in a text by Louis Bardunnet à propos de quelques séances de clairvoyance. They were trying to use clairvoyance to anticipate artillery and test it basically in 1916. The results were considered inconclusive. There were also efforts to investigate dowsing by the French military in the war to figure out better ways to find water sources. And there's a line we can see between scrying, clairvoyance, and remote viewing, which is not hard to miss. But something more proximate is perhaps the origin of the American project, which is what we could call the ensuing reality of the image, from occult Nazis to psychic research. So occult Nazis are mostly myth. Those of us in the study of Western esotericism mostly know this. It's true Himmler and some other Nazis were occultists, but occultism wasn't central to Nazi ideology. What was what was called positives Christentum, positive Christianity, which was an Aryanized form of Christianity. But the idea of occult Nazis started appearing in pulp novels. And in a way, we have an occult Germany actually appearing in the First World War novels too. So this is a general characterization of Germany by Germany's opponents, but it's especially prominent in during the war in writings of folks like Dennis Wheatley in The Strange Conflict of 1941, depicted here, which, yeah, well, anyway, we have our occult Nazis trope. It culminates in Indiana Jones. You've seen the trope, but it also appears in more sophisticated form in Adorno and Horkheimer, but we can bracket that off for a moment. But it was after the war, there was the idea that there had been occult Nazis, and as part of Operation Paperclip, in addition to considering German scientists, they investigated whether the German Heritage Institute had actually discovered anything interesting in occult. They decided that they didn't get anything substantive out of it. But out of that, a medical officer who served during the war named, he's a Croatian-American, I don't know how I pronounced his name, but Andrija Puharic, authored on the possible, there's a typo in there, on the possible usefulness of ESP in psychological warfare, a memo he submitted to the US government in 1952. And that's also the year in which the US government starts investing in psychical research. Yeah, part of it is around the idea of a side gap between Russia. I'll get to that. But accelerating us closer to the 1970s and the birth of Gondola Wish, there's a very interesting Time magazine article of 1973. It's interesting for two reasons. Underappreciated reason number one, it first introduces Thomas Kuhn to a popular American reading public and his notion of paradigm. And two, it describes the psychical powers and treats them as real. Indeed, it says, is science on the verge of some bold new paradigm? And paradigm was a new sexy word. It's talking about them. Some scientists, in fact, are exploring what once would have been considered irrational. And then he goes on to say a questionnaire to the new scientists last fall drew more than 1,500 answers. Most of them from working scientists and technologists. Nearly 70% of the respondents could be classified as, they had a term for this, but believers in the possibility of psychic powers of various hues. Only 3% believe that ESP is an impossibility. And indeed, we have here depicted on the lower right, one of the people who will be central to the remote viewing project later, Ingo Swan. And he's trying to control the temperature of vacuum bottles with his mind. And these are all depictions from the text. And it also imagines the new physics is relevant to this, but we'll get to that in the next slide. So part of what made it seem credible to Time magazine and others was a perhaps not fully artificial connection to the notion of quantum physics. And notions of quantum physics go back quite early. They become associated with the Copenhagen interpretation, although I think I read Niels Bohr as more of a positivist than the standard Copenhagen interpretation does. There's actually like 5 different things that are called the Copenhagen interpretation. If there are any other quantum physics fanboys like me in the audience, we can talk more about interpretations of quantum physics in the Q&A. But one of them by the physicist Eugene Wigner who argued in 1961, until not many so years ago, the existence of a mind or soul would have been passionately denied by most physical scientists, but it has been shown that the quantum description of objects is influenced by impressions entering my consciousness. So just to take a step back, Niels Bohr had already showed that as a consequence of quantum measurement, you had to take into position the act of measurement itself. This gets interpreted by a number of quantum physics. It becomes one mainstream channel, the idea that it is consciousness itself that resolves and causes waveform collapse, basically. That's the, and we had other quantum physicists like Wolfgang Pauli are arguing that this leads us into a kind of lucid mysticism. And he said ESP is the borderland between physics and psychology. He thought it could be explained by a Schopenhauerian will which breaks through space and time. And Robert Oppenheimer's "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds" is a quote from the Bhagavad Gita, because many folks in the atom bomb research community and early quantum physics community were turning to Indian philosophical thought as ways to try and explain what they saw as the reintroduction of the problem of consciousness in quantum physics. More concretely, the Stargate project emerged from the Cold War psi gap. According to a Defense Intelligence Agency report from 1972, Soviet efforts in the field of psi research might enable them to do some of the following. A, know the contents of top secret US documents, the movements of our troops and ships, and the location and nature of our military installations. B, mold the thoughts of key US military and civilian leaders at a distance. Wow, molding thoughts. C, cause the instant death of US officials at a distance. D, disable at a distance US military equipment of all types. So the Soviets have got it. And ironically, subsequently, scholars, I think Vasilyev is his name, has noted that the Soviets in the 1960s had false reports that the US was ahead in the psychical arms race. So they're playing back and forth with each other. But in any case, in 1976, CIA Director George Bush, yes, that Bush, the first President Bush, enthusiastically gave retired astronaut Edgar Mitchell permission to organize high-level seminars at the CIA to discuss possible intelligence applications of parapsychology. This is from a now declassified text, Psychic Warfare, from 1988. Now, Bush was only if any of you know your American history, which you wouldn't have, he was only in that role as head of CIA for 1 year, and then he didn't even finish out the year. So the project didn't begin until 2 years later, but there's evidence that he would have, he was interested in backing it. According to one of the central people who was starting in 1978 and continued in 1995, an institution known as the Stanford Research Institute, directed by two physicists, Russell Targ and Harold Putarf, focused on remote viewing, psychokinesis, and what they called anomalous cognition. And as Russell Targ often said in one later interview, "I often say that I worked as a psychic spy for the CIA and found God." So it's not just the Gateway memo here. This is an interesting finding. But now we're back to the Gateway memo and how does this fit into our world? So to make sense, what follows in the memo is astonishing, but it's not random. It's what happens when Cold War rationality collides with the unthinkable and decides to take it seriously, perhaps. To make sense of what the Gateway process was claiming, to even begin to grasp the language it used, we need to step back. Oops, sorry. It's an inheritance of a certain kinds of, I cut a bunch of stuff here, so I'll just read the memo rather than the text. Rhine is really influential in the backdrop here, but I again found it necessary to use physics to bring the whole phenomena of out-of-body states, this is from the memo itself, into the language of physical sciences to remove the stigma of its occult connotation. So if you're wondering, does the psychical research really count as esotericism? It's a question mark here, but there they seem to be trying very specifically, and this is repeated at different documents and part of both Stargate and Gateway. They know that they're treading in terrain associated with the occult, and they're trying to render it scientifically credible. And specifically, Robert Monroe was a dude who was a radio broadcaster who was very interested in developing sleep tapes that you could listen to while you fell asleep, and you could like learn in your sleep, basically. But he was also interested in trying to make people fall asleep faster, and produced basically kind of white noise that you would get in different parts of your brain. And then he thought or claimed that jumped him out of his body and led to these kind of astral travel experiences that he chronicled in the 1970s bestseller, Journey Out of the Body. That's a more recent cover because it's still in print. This is an illustration of in the text itself about what the gateway process is doing to your brain. I think it might not be hyper time, but it might be hyperspace here because there are a lot of dimensions going on. More specifically, and this is the gateway memo again, magic wands and enchanted scepters have been part of folklore and occult practices of many cultures. And then it tells you how to use one. The participants then extrude the dot into the shape of a sparkling, vibrating cylinder of energy, which he then uses to channel force from the universe to selected parts of his body for the purposes of healing and revitalization. The text justifies itself in the following terms. Like certain strange discoveries of quantum physics, note the reference, the radical reorientation of this theory suddenly makes sense of the paradoxical sayings of mystics throughout the ages. So we have an example of quantum mysticism. The consciousness of the absolute must project a hologram of itself and then perceive itself. That's some pretty intense writing for the CIA, for a military intelligence document in the period. This is part of a broader context. The first funded research, I cut this from earlier, but I want to recap, was actually Rhine, who was funded first by the Navy in 1952 to investigate whether pets could psychically sense things. He applied to do more, but that was what they were willing to fund. Gondola Wish, which becomes Stargate in 1978, the Gateway Memo in 1983. Against this context, we have a fictional book, by the way, the Montauk Project, which presented itself as somewhat serious and led toward a bunch of conspiracy theories, but is also the direct inspiration for the Stranger Things series, which described itself originally was going to be set in Montauk, and then they changed that because they couldn't get permissions. But that's the fictionalization of this. Gateway's declassified first in 2003. Stranger Things launches in 2015. Stargate is declassified in 2017. And in 2021, the Gateway goes viral on a platform I have to call shitter. The Monroe Institute, however, even after Gateway ends, continues to exist. And the former Stanford Research Intelligence Institute goes private. It becomes the Sci-Tech Intelligence Institute. And they claim at least that they've been consistently recontacted by the U.S. military since then, but as private contractors. So it's unclear whether the military psychic industrial complex has actually ended, but it's definitely, like a lot of things in the U.S. government, been privatized and is now being used by corporate actors for their own benefit. So let me begin to take us on to conclusions, because I have a last figure who might surprise you and who's the subject of another monograph that I'm going to finish before I get to the one I was just presenting to. So here's the weird thing. There's a Shinto shrine and a Shinto priest in the CIA Stargate projects. The document is called, it's document type CREST, which is a research document. It's in the Stargate collection. It was declassified in 2005. And it refers to a Dr. Hiroshi Motoyama. I prefer to use the Japanese order, Motoyama Hiroshi, and to a particular shrine called Tamamitsu Jinja. What is a Shinto shrine doing there? Well, let me tell you. Tucked away in a quiet Tokyo suburb, just off a tree-lined street near Inokashira Park, stands an unremarkable shrine called Tamamitsu Jinja. Its name means the shrine of the divine radiant jewel. It isn't ancient. It doesn't draw crowds. Nothing in its modest architecture signals that it might matter, but looks deceive, because just beyond the torii gate, obscured from view, stands a plain concrete building. Its main identifier is a small plaque etched with 4 inconspicuous English letters, IARP. They stand for the International Association of Religion and Parapsychology. And that's our first clue that something stranger than worship is going on here. I guess I use strange a lot in this talk because of Stranger Things. Forget it. Anyway, the shrine itself was founded in 1949 after a spirit medium named Motoyama Kinue, poised to leap off a cliff, she was thrown back by a gust of wind, and she heard a divine voice instructing her to save the world from the devastations of war. But its real center of gravity lies not in her origin story, however miraculous, but what followed, because since 1960, the IARP Institute has been located on the shrine precincts and modeled after Duke University's Laboratory of Parapsychology, and has functioned as one of Japan's central hubs for psychical research. Where's my page? And from the early 1960s until his death in 2015, the Institute's director, the Shrine's high priest, Motoyama Hiroshi, Kinoe's adopted son, a man with a PhD in philosophy, with a focus on comparative religion, and a self-proclaimed psychic healer, Kundalini yoga adept, presided over a surreal and relentless parade of seekers. Japanese and international psychics, spiritual healers, South Asian gurus, yoga practitioners, apparently at least one CIA agent unawares, as well as his own disciples and medical patients. And indeed, he's responsible for smuggling Western esoteric practices into Japanese philosophy. And I have a separate talk on that. I can give it another time. But his psychical research fits not some reified notion of the Japanese mind, but rather is the product of the same, he had studied with Rhine very specifically, and he's importing that model into Japan. What does this tell us? Okay, so I just put new conclusions on like last night, and maybe they're a mistake, but I'm beginning to regret them. But now I'll read them to you anyway. Okay, first takeaway, rationality has a history, right? Both in terms of content and image. Its image is of a mythologized version of the mind as pure, universal, and disembodied. That's the gateway made literal. The gateway imagined your mind could be fully disembodied, fully pure, fully universal. This was also rooted in hierarchies and the production of epistemic others. There's a tension between a normative ideal of how humans should think and a descriptive account of how we actually do. Again, neither is wrong on their own. I think actually philosophical arguments about how we should reason or think critically can be good things. I'm not attacking that, but there's a fundamental, although we have to be very careful about the cultural biases and things that we're bringing in, but there's a confusion about when we're talking about what people should do and what they actually do. And those are very separate projects, and each have their own internal contradictions, especially when normative models claim universal scope. I was thinking of Voter a little bit here, especially when normative models claim universal scope without accounting for the historical and cultural specificity of their assumptions. Next. Cold War institutions promoted a vision of the rational mind as a calculating machine, Bayesian, probabilistic, individualistic. My critique is directed less at later cognitive models than how cybernetic rationality is embedded even as cybernetics has vanished. This is the model behind a lot of AI research and still shapes the social sciences, but it's incomplete and misleading, and I need at least 4 critical corrections. Rationality is contextual and often motivated. Humans, I can explain this in more detail, but humans thinking communities were shaped by norms and trust. Communities develop their own epistemic norms, and the irrational binary is messy and should be rejected. The very idea of declarative belief is itself an analytical obstacle. When interviewing my own research agents, they would often, in Japan or whatever, I would ask them whether they believed in, I don't know, talismans or something like that, and they would describe hanbun shinjiru, half belief. And I think a lot of what we do, they would say, I do this, but I don't know if I believe it. And often when I ask my students, do you believe in magical talismans? They say no, but when I ask them, do you have a lucky charm that you wear around your neck? They often do. And so I think there is a problem built into the very way that we understand belief and its bifurcation from practice. And I think it becomes an obstacle. I'm increasing the practical, pragmatic turn is happening in our field, and I think that's a good thing. But it shouldn't be the whole thing anyway. We are not isolated reasoners or Bayesianing agent. Thought is embodied in active, collective, and often non-declarative. Preferences are not exogenous to the markets, and the markets do not reach equilibrium. Markets actually produce preferences, and so one of the failures, anyway, that's a separate conversation. Cold War military industrial complex is also a product of the same quote-unquote rationality, or at least nearly so. Following Duhem Quine, this is left over from an earlier version of the talk, both science and ritual adjust to auxiliary assumptions when predictions fail. Neither are more or less rational. I can explain this more if you're curious, but I should just say magic is not uniquely unfalsifiable. Popperian distinction between falsifiability doesn't really work here. Neither is science immune to interpretive flexibility. Indeed, psychical research often had to better conform to scientific norms because it encountered pushback. Psychic powers moved from margin to mainstream and then back to the margins again. So the pseudoscience demarcation problem is deeper than some folks tend to think. Moreover, like non-Euclidean geometry, multiple self-consistent logics are possible, but grounded in different first principles. Here, we could go into Buddhist logics, or we could talk about a whole bunch of other things, but at least any fellow, non-dialethic, anyway, okay, sorry, I should stop asking rhetorical questions that give blank looks. Okay, key 5, belief, rationality, epistemic trust. Most quote-unquote rational beliefs, like heliocentrism, are not conclusions of private reasoning, but products of trust in different epistemic authorities. When I ask my students, again, how do you know that the Earth orbits the sun? Is there some experiment you've done? Is there some empirical evidence that has convinced you of this? They say, no, we kind of learned it in school. And then when I tell them that actually the center of the Earth orbit is not the sun, it's the barycenter, which is a gravitational point partially between the Earth and the sun, they're like, whoa, mind blown. But it shows that part of what we think of when we think of rational beliefs is stuff that people who we trusted have taught us. And to be clear, I think it's better to trust your high school teachers than it is random YouTube celebrities or Instagram influencers, but we have to recognize that trust is central to a lot of epistemic norms. What are often labeled alternative rationalities, I would think are better described as different epistemic communities with distinct linguistic categories, ontological commitments, and epistemic authorities. So the crux of the matter for me is not about rationality per se, and culture alone doesn't explain differences. A biomedical physician and a holistic medicine practitioner might share quote unquote cultures, even be siblings, share languages, etc., but differ in what they count as a valid source of knowledge. Also, just because I want to kick Taylor, that's part of more of the chapter that this is based on than the talk, but Charles Taylor secularity posits above itself in a linear decline in enchantment, but what he misses are porous selves that persist in popular belief, quantum physics, and even the CIA, and body-mind entanglements that refuse strict separation. Disenchantment was a myth. It's a long conclusion, so I added a little coda. Rationality has a history. The gateway and other moments in Cold War are esoteric rationality. That's not a sentence, sorry. The boundaries between religion, science, and magic are not fixed. They're negotiated, regulated, and sometimes blurred beyond recognition. And then finally, modernization and secularization theory of Taylor's sort was never talking about everybody. Looked at through a dark prism, the primary issues of contention in many sectors of society today are not science versus religion, the role of faith in the public sphere, the problem of pluralism, or tensions between technology and the sacred, or even the class of civilization or the fate of neoliberalism. Outbreaks like QAnon uprising are not unusual. We live in the world where the meaning of CIA mind control goes viral, where the prognostications of psychics, alternative healers, conspiracy theorists, and haunted geographies are central to the lives of many. And this is equally the 21st century. There was never a modernity that has fallen away. We were not more rational or more sane in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, much less the 1930s, the 1940s. This is our world. And while there are changes, in some extent, it has always been like this. And yet, we have been compartmentalized in our disciplinary silos, and hence we have barely begun to theorize it as such. There's time that we begin to do so. Thank you.